Morning. That was like the best one ever. I'd like to welcome everybody this morning. I'm excited to talk about the prophets this morning. I appreciate Cooper reading that message. That's not one that you amen as much as some of the other scripture readings we typically have. Which of your fathers did the prophets not persecute and kill? Way to set the mood, right? Listen, that comes in the context of Stephen preaching the gospel to Jews. And he calls them uncircumcised of heart and ear. Which of the prophets did your fathers not persecute and kill? Hot words, very aggressive words that he comes in with. And I think it's interesting that he references the prophets there because he sounds quite a bit like some of the prophets. And we're going to look at that a little bit this morning. Before I go too much farther, I forgot the one announcement I wanted to make. We're starting back up. The school year has begun. Seems like earlier and earlier, but it's begun this year, and all the kids are in school, so we're doing our youth devos. Again, in the past, Justin Hill and Courtney and I, we all lived in the same apartment complex. So it was like it was at one place, but it was at two places every other week, and we just kind of hosted it initially. This go around for at least the next couple of months, we're hoping that some of you will host it. That's not because we don't want to. We put our names on the list first. We love having the kids over, but want to give everyone an opportunity to serve and want to let some of the kids have a chance to meet some of the people they may not talk to as much, So if you want to host a devotional for the youth, there is a sign-up sheet, because we can have sign-up sheets now that stay here. And if you want, just write your name down there. If you're unsure about a date or if you want to pencil something in, we're super flexible. We'd love for the kids to be able to come over to your house, have a meal, and have a devotional time. So if you have any questions about that, check with me or Justin or Courtney or me. So if you have any questions, we'll get that going, and it'll be a really good thing. We're continuing the series that we've been doing the last couple of months, I guess. It's been like 3 months now. We're looking at All In. We started off, if you remember, in April maybe? I think it might have been April. We started off talking about dispensations and expectations. That there are different time periods where God may have required what looked to be different things, but in actuality, he has always expected the same. And that is for people who follow him to be all in. We then looked at the patriarchs and how in that first dispensation, the patriarchs were all in. We talked about Job being all in. We looked at Abraham and the things that he did that without question, he was all in, trusting God. And then we looked at the most recent lesson on this. We looked at the law and how the law that God gave the people of Israel designed a people that were all in. It permeated every aspect of their life. You couldn't live a day as a Jew under the law without being mindful of the law. It talked about how you woke up, it talked about how you rested, talked about how you ate, how you cleaned yourself before and after eating. It talked about how you took care of diseases. It talked about how you went to the restroom. It talked about what you did with your food and your money. It talked about what sacrifices. Listen, it created a culture, and it permeated the lives of these Jewish people, and it demanded, if you were going to keep the law, it demanded that you were all in. Then we looked, I guess not then, but today we're going to look at the prophets. And this is kind of a difficult study, because when you read through the Bible, and I know many of us have read through the whole Bible, how much of the prophets do you remember? We're just going to be honest here, right? When you think about the prophets, what immediately comes to your mind? Future telling about Jesus, right? That's immediately what comes to my mind, and that's almost always the answer I get. When we think about the prophets, we think about they prophesied about a lot of things, but specifically Jesus coming and what would surround Jesus coming. Things like the virgin birth, being crucified, that sort of stuff. But prophets and being a prophet and the role of a prophet were a lot more than that. That was a crazy important part, but it was just a part. The prophets actually functioned, a better example would be calling them a mouthpiece for God. You may have heard that expression before. Exodus chapter 7 gives us a good example of what that would look like. In Exodus 7, Moses is not wanting to go before Pharaoh, and so God tells Moses, okay, Aaron will be like a prophet to you. Take Aaron with you, and I'll give you the words, and you will be like God to Aaron, and Aaron will be like a prophet to Pharaoh. So God breaks down what a prophet is. A prophet is the spokesperson on behalf of whomever they're speaking, right? And so the prophets were not just fortune tellers who prophesied about Jesus and no one knew what they were talking about, but they were people who in their time and in their place spoke on behalf of God. And they said a lot more than just, hey, in 700 years when we're all dead, this guy's going to come and redeem us all, right? They said a lot more than that. They were, and if you read through the prophets, you'll notice a lot of long and difficult poetry because the prophets wrote in poetry. They wrote a lot of poetry. If you look at the way that they chose to write some of their messages, you kind of have three buckets. And within these three buckets, you have very dense Hebrew poetry that gets kind of wordy and is really detailed and really specific. Bucket number one, you have the accusation. The prophets, a huge chunk of the prophets is accusation poetry. You have sinned and you're horrible people. And they say it in various ways, right? Sometimes they use metaphors. Sometimes they use contrasts. They use a lot of literary elements. If you remember back in language arts, they use a lot of literary elements to construct a big chunk of their letters, which are, you guys are not doing what you're supposed to be doing. You are not keeping the covenant that God made with you. You are neglecting the poor. You are letting violence run through your cities. You are worshiping other gods. You're doing it wrong, right? Big chunk, really dense. That's bucket number one. Bucket number two is a smaller bucket, but a very important bucket. It's just not a very big. They don't spend a lot of time on it because it's pretty simple. And that's the make a choice bucket, right? So bucket number one is, you guys are the worst. Bucket number two is, you have a choice. You're not the worst by someone else's fault. This is your choice. Similar to how Joshua says, choose this day who you will serve, but as for me and my house we will serve. That kind of statement you find throughout the prophets, where they will accuse and they will say, today is a day to turn to the Lord, or today is a day to make a choice, right? And they will call that choice into the arena and lay it before the people they're speaking to. Bucket number three is another big bucket. So you have a big bucket of accusation, a smaller bucket, but a vital bucket of a call to a choice, and then another big bucket of what I have written down as judgment or the day of the Lord. And you'll see that phrase, specifically the day of the Lord, a lot throughout the prophets because they talk about it a lot. And it almost always is in the context of the judgment. Because you have not, the day of the Lord is coming. And it's not usually a very pleasant thing when the day of the Lord comes for the people that they're prophesying to. Because you have chosen this, there is judgment, there will be, and then it goes into, remember we said it's a big bucket with poetry, it goes into poetic detail about the wickedness that is going to be overthrown, the powers that are going to be put at rest, the destruction that will come through because of the judgment, because of the choice, because of the accusation. So those are kind of your buckets, right? And it's a lot more detailed and a lot more fun than that, but that's sort of your base. You need that foundation when you read the prophets. You got your three buckets. They also, a good way of describing what the prophets did is they were the people who brought to light what was wrong. So comedians, stand-up comedians, what's one of the funniest things that they do? Generally, it's when they point to two things that are incongruent, but we all pretend like they go together, right? They look at one thing and they say, we all say this thing is like this, but what about this? And they expose the contrast or the way that these two things don't work together, right? I wish I had a better example, but it's a common theme. You'll notice it throughout stand-up comedy. If you listen to almost anything, you will see that they will point out inconsistencies. That's very much what the prophets did on behalf of God. God made a covenant with these people, and the prophets, on behalf of God, showed up and said, covenant, what's happening? We've got an issue, right? But they did it in these extreme demonstrative ways, very over the top, very, like we already mentioned, big language, big literary works that they would do. But they also did this other thing that some people, I read, it's called sign acts. What I would call them are object lessons. And we're going to spend some time looking at some of those today. But they had all of this really big job that the prophets had. And the interesting part about the prophets, as opposed to some of the other things that we've looked at in this all-in series, is the prophets are still under that Mosaical age, right? They're still in the Mosaical dispensation. And so when they are coming to the people, what they're doing is saying, you remember what the day in the life of a Jew under the law was supposed to look like? It doesn't look like that. There is no care for the poor. You guys are worshiping other gods. You are profaning the name of God. You are doing all these things. And they're calling into light the actions of the people and how they do not work with the covenant. I heard someone describe them as God's covenant watchdogs, right? They are out and they are ready to point out where the people of God are not following the covenant. I already mentioned there are some who did writing and some who did not. But even the ones that did writing did some crazy things. And we're going to look at those today. What I really hope that we get from this lesson is, number one, a greater respect for the prophets, because they were incredible. Number two, I hope that some of these stories will surprise you into going and read them, all right? Like, some of these are very strange. Go read what the prophets did and take a second and try and read some of what they said. It's challenging in a lot of ways, and it is incredibly rich. A lot of the references in the New Testament to the Old Testament tie into the prophets. And if we don't understand the prophets, then we're definitely missing something that is trying to be tied into the story of Jesus. So, second thing, I hope it'll encourage you to go read some more of the prophets. And third, I hope, again, we can take some personal inventory and reflect on the fact that we need to be all in. That is what God has expected every step of the way. So we're going to look at, like I said, some of these things that the prophets did. If you will, turn to Ezekiel is where we're going to start. Ezekiel, and start in chapter 4. Being a prophet of God was an occupational hazard. Just that job was a hazard. As we read through some of these, you are going to understand exactly that statement. Ezekiel chapter 4 and verse 1. God gives Ezekiel some object lessons that Ezekiel has to go present in public to the nation. So, chapter 4 and verse 1, God addresses Ezekiel and says, "And you, son of man, take a brick and lay it before you and engrave on it a city, even Jerusalem, and put siege work against it and build a siege wall against it and cast up a mound against it, set camps also against it and plant battering rams against it all around. And you take an iron griddle and place it as an iron wall between you and the city. Set your face towards it and let it be in the state of siege and press the siege against it. This is a sign for the house of Israel." All right, so here's what we got. Verse 1 through 3, God has come to Ezekiel and he said, all right, take a rock, take a brick, and carve out the image of a city, even Jerusalem. Carve out a model. So what God has asked is, Dan does model trains, right? That's what God asked. He said, I want you to make a model of the city of Jerusalem on a rock. And then, in front of everyone, surround it like it's under siege. Put camps around it, put walls up around it. I want you to model this city being taken over. Weird. Probably not going to be taken very well by the people he's doing that in front of, but that's not where it stops. So first, make this model siege. And then second part of this, verse 4 says, "Then lie on your left side and place the punishment of the house of Israel upon it. For the number of days that you lie on it, you shall bear their punishment. For I assign you a number of days, 390 days I assign you, 390 days, equal to the number of years of their punishment. So long shall you bear the punishment of the house of Israel. So God has just told Ezekiel, you're going to build this model. You're going to surround it like it's being taken over, and you're going to lay on your side for 390 days. Now, I know that in our modern world of Netflix and Facebook, and some of us can lay on our side for quite a while, all right? Like, I understand that. College football season's coming up. I get laying on our side but one day puts me out of business. When I'm on my side for even an extended several hours, I got to get up. I got to do something. Jeremiah had to lay on his side for 300. We're talking more than a year here that he had to stay in your home is one thing, lay on your side is a completely different thing. The challenge that would have been to Ezekiel, both physically and mentally, this was not a small ask of God to Ezekiel. So look in verse 6. And when you have completed these, you shall lie down a second time, but on your right side, and bear the punishment of the house of Judah. 40 days I assign you, a day for each year, and you shall set your face towards the siege of Jerusalem with your arm bared, and you shall prophesy against the city, and behold, I will place cords upon you, so that you cannot turn from one side to the other till you have completed the days of your siege. So now we're taking it a step further. Flip over, Ezekiel, and lay on your right side for 40 days, symbolizing 40 years. And I'm going to bind you so that you can't turn, and you're going to prophesy. If he's going to prophesy, where does that likely mean that this was taking place? Somewhere where people could hear him, right? And so what you have effectively is this strange man laying in the middle of the city with a model of your city being surrounded like it's about to be taken over, laying on his side for an extended period of time, shouting prophecy out to people. Prophecy just meaning what God has said. Remember our buckets. Accusation, make a choice, and judgment. This is bizarre, and it gets weirder, all right? It gets even weirder. Let's keep reading. In verse 9, and I'm just going to read what the Bible says here, okay? Follow with me if you will. Verse 9 says, and this is still God speaking to Ezekiel, and you take wheat and barley beans and lentils, millet and emmer, and put them into a single vessel and make yourself bread from them. During the number of days that you lie on your side, 390 days, you shall eat it. Not too big of a deal. God gives him a nice little recipe. In fact, I don't know if you guys have been to Walmart before, probably, but if you see I think it's in the frozen section, they have what's called Ezekiel 4:9 bread. Have you heard about that? Okay, I don't want anything to do with Ezekiel 4:9 bread. Just give it 4 more verses and you'll know why. But I don't think they make their bread like that. But listen, what they do is they take this exact recipe, and that's sort of their marketing strategies. They make this bread with those ingredients -1 that we're about to see. So let's keep reading. Verse 10, it says, and your food that you eat shall be by weight, 20 shekels a day from day to day. You shall eat it, and water you shall drink by measure, the 1/6 part of a hin. From day to day you shall drink, and you shall eat it as a barley cake. Okay, so we're going to pause there. I want to point out something before we get to that. Notice it's rationed portions. There's a specific amount that Ezekiel is allowed to eat and drink while he is laying on his side and has the model of the city under siege. All of this is an object lesson. Remember this as we're reading it. All of this is an object lesson that Ezekiel is showing the people what it is going to be like. You are going to be bound up, right, in captivity. Your city is going to be under siege. You are not going to have your full portion of food. You're going to have rationed food, scarcity, right? And then the next part, where did we stop? Verse 13. You shall eat it as a barley cake, baking it in their sight on human dung. And the Lord said, thus shall the people of Israel eat their bread, unclean among the nations, where I will drive them. So pause. God has just commanded. He just made this way worse, right? I was almost okay with it until this. And in fact, you'll see Ezekiel's not even okay with this, and God compromises with him a little bit. But God says, here's the principle, right? You're going to cook this bread on human waste, and it is going to symbolize the uncleanness that you will live in while you are under siege, right? Ezekiel is doing an object lesson. He's got a part that shows what the whole is going to look like. Verse 14, then I, that's Ezekiel, said, Ah, Lord God, behold, I have never defiled myself from my youth. Up until now, I've never eaten what died of itself or what was torn by beasts, nor has tainted meat come into my mouth, which, if you remember some of the commandments in the law, these are all kinds of meat that under the law, they were not supposed to eat, torn by beasts, died within itself, and that sort of thing. So he says, I've never eaten anything unclean. In verse 15, then the Lord said to me, see, I assign to you, even better, cow's dung instead of human dung on which you may prepare your bread. So we'll just stop right there. Ezekiel does this, okay? Like, have y'all read in the Bible where it'll say something crazy and then the person will not do what the Lord said? Like, we read that. That's not uncommon. But he did it. This is an insane ask. This is a big ask. What was his answer, you think, when people came up to him laying in the street yelling out, you are all doomed and this is your fate? Why are you cooking your bread like that? God told me to. Would we give him any credibility here? Not a lick. I'd say he was crazy. That's what I'd say. I would hold Bonnie on the other side of me as we passed by him on the road. I'm not kidding. Like, you think about what's going on here. This is radical. This is huge, what God is asking of Ezekiel, and he does it. This life that Ezekiel is living is not his. No one would choose to do this on their own, right? We would look at this and say, this guy has some kind of issue, and yet he was doing exactly what God asked him to do. Prophet of God is an occupational hazard. Let's go to the very next thing in chapter 5, and we won't read this because we're running out of time already. But in chapter 5, God has him cut off all of his hair and his beard and says, separate it into 3 piles. In one pile, you're going to burn. Another pile, you're going to bury. And another pile, you're going to chop up with a sword. And you're going to do this in front of everybody. Y'all smelled burning hair? Not pleasant. Listen, this is weird. This is weird, and it's challenging, and it was weird then. And if you notice, often the prophets are not listened to. And we kind of get it at this point, right? Because God had them do some pretty radical things. We're not going to read this whole story for time's sake, but Elijah in 1 Kings chapter 18 has a showdown with the prophets of Baal. Remember, there are some prophets who write, like Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Hosea, Zephaniah, all the prophets in the back half of the Old Testament. And then there are prophets who were in the story that did not write. And Elijah and Elisha and Nathan, those would be examples of the non-writing prophets. Think about Elijah's work while he was on the earth. We're just going to take this one example in 1 Kings chapter 18. He is up on a mountain with hundreds of prophets of a foreign god that he knows is not real. And things get pretty intense. I encourage you, go back and read this story, because I think often we read it as a joke and we're like, oh, those dumb prophets of Baal, it's not a real God. Don't they know any better, right? Like, we just read it and we kind of blow it off. Take a second, put yourself in Elijah's shoes and watch what's happening. Hundreds of people are dancing around an altar, yelling and screaming at the top of their lungs. I don't mean to be entirely crass here, but have you ever seen someone who was not sober, who was just in the street yelling? It's unsettling, right? Hundreds of people doing that kind of thing. They're working each other up into a frenzy, an emotional frenzy, trying to get their god Baal to respond, and then they start cutting themselves. Do you understand? This was a hostile group of people. They were dancing around in some sort of religious act. They were screaming at the top of their lungs and began to cut their bodies to attempt to solicit a response from their God. And Elijah, who was there with him? God, but no one. Okay? All by himself on a mountain in a battle between these prophets, enemies on this side who are willing to cut themselves. That's a terrifying position to be in, right? course, we know the end of the story, that Elijah simply prays to God and he consumes the entire altar and all the water that was around it and put on it. And it's an incredible story. Go back and read about Elijah because he was awesome and really difficult, but he was really cool. So, but listen, to be asked to go up on a mountain in hostile territory with what we would call unstable people, to say the least, that's not easy. That's a big ask on God's part. Look at Isaiah. Look at Isaiah chapter 20. Wrong way. Isaiah chapter 20, God gives Isaiah a task. He wants him to do a sign act or an object lesson for the people of Israel. And look at chapter 20 and verse 1. It says, in the year that the commander-in-chief who was sent by Sargon, the king of Assyria, came to Ashdod and fought against it and captured it. Okay, so he gave us some context. At this time in the story, in the timeline, at that time, verse 2, the Lord spoke by Isaiah, the son of Amoz, saying, go, and listen, I am just reading what the Bible says, not trying to be funny. Go and loose the sackcloth from your waist and take off your sandals from your feet. And he did so, walking naked and barefoot. God commanded his prophet to strip down to nothing and walk throughout the city. Verse 3, then the Lord said, as my servant Isaiah has walked naked and barefoot for 3 years, okay, as a sign and a portent against Egypt and Cush, so shall the king of Assyria lead away the Egyptian captives and the Cushites, exiles, both the young and the old, naked and barefoot, with buttocks uncovered, the nakedness of Egypt. Then they shall be dismayed and ashamed because of Cush their hope and of Egypt their boast. And the inhabitants of this coastland will say in that day, behold, this is what has happened to those whom we hoped and whom we fled to for help to be delivered from the king of Assyria. And how shall we escape? Listen, so God has said, Isaiah, you're going to go to these people, and for 3 years, you're going to walk around the city prophesying without any clothes on. Because that's how they're about to leave. All of them are about to be stripped of everything, humiliated, taken in complete vulnerability. They are going to be taken from their land. And as a sign of that, to let them know what's coming, Isaiah, my prophet, you're going to do that first. For 3. I mean, I would have said no, right? I would have said, God, that doesn't seem seemly, right? That doesn't seem like it's appropriate. Isn't there a different way we could go about this? What do you think people thought about the naked guy? That's probably what they called him. They didn't probably call him Isaiah. It was just the naked guy for 3 years, y'all. 3 years. He was a staple, at this point, And this is what God asked of Isaiah, not to mention all of the other things that Isaiah had to say while he was doing this. It wasn't even funny because he just walks around with no clothes on telling us that we're going to be like him someday. I would have written him off. I would have said he was crazy. I think all of us would have. None of us would have taken seriously what was happening. We would have all said that this is ridiculous. We would have said, certainly no man of God would do such a thing. But he was a prophet of God, and he was commanded to do this. Embarrassing, vulnerable. That was what God asked, and it was a big ask. Look at one more. Look at Hosea. I think we've got some familiarity with the book of Hosea, and we maybe know some of the foundation. But Hosea was a prophet of God, and he was commanded right off the bat at the beginning of his writing to do another one of these object lessons or sign acts. Verse 2 says, Hosea chapter 1 and verse 2 says, when the Lord first spoke through Hosea, the Lord said to Hosea, go, take yourself a wife of prostitution and have children of prostitution. For the land commits great prostitution by forsaking the Lord. So he went and took Gomer, the daughter of Diblaim, and she conceived and bore him a son. God just told his prophet to go marry a prostitute. That's like no getting around that. That's exactly what he commanded to happen. And again, we'll see it's because, as we saw, it's because it's an object lesson. Just like Hosea has married a woman who is notoriously unfaithful and will continue to be unfaithful, Israel is married to God, and Israel is the woman who is unfaithful. Israel has not been faithful to God and the covenant that they made together. But couldn't he have just had him say it? You know? I mean, we're not talking about, like, even if you go back to some of these examples that we've looked at, Isaiah had to walk around for 3 years. At the end of 3 years, I don't know if you recover from that, to be honest. Your reputation doesn't necessarily recover from being the naked guy. But like after 3 years, it's done. After 190 days, Ezekiel got to stand up and turn over. And after 40 days, he was done, right? This is every day, every minute for the rest of your life. Like this is go marry this woman. That's not the kind of choice that we generally think of God making for us, right? But he did. And then it gets really weird because as soon as they start having kids, God has some names picked out. And they're not necessarily names that I would choose, but God picks out names for Hosea's children. Verse 4, the Lord said to him, after she conceived and bore a son, the Lord said to him, call his name Jezreel. For in just a little while I will punish the house of Jehu for the blood of Jezreel, and I will put an end to the kingdom of the house of Israel, and on that day I will break the bow of Israel in the valley of Jezreel. So, a little bit of background. Jehu was this really, really wicked king who killed a lot of people in Jezreel. And Isaiah has to name his son after a tragedy. It would be the equivalent of saying, name your son 9/11. Like that's the idea here. A tragedy, a wicked act, something that was awful where hundreds, if not thousands of people died. That's your child's name because he's going to be a reminder and everyone's going to know that's Jezreel. And every time they hear Jezreel, they're thinking that awful tragedy that Jehu did. And it's going to be a sign because Jehu's going to be punished. Next child, verse 6. She conceived again and bore a daughter. And the Lord said to him, call her name Bonnie, because it's the best name ever. No, he said, call her name No Mercy. What? Like, what kind of name is that? Right? God says you're going to have a kid, and they're going to be running around, and you're going to name her No Mercy. It gets worse. Third child, okay? Third child. In verse 8, when she had weaned No Mercy, which is her daughter's name, she conceived and bore a son, and the Lord said, call his name Not My People. That's my son's name. Hello, I'm Hosea. Here's my son, Not My People. Like, what does... Okay, let's take for a second and think about, he's married to a prostitute. It very well could be that the son was not his people. Like, that would have been an object lesson in and of itself, And so God says these names are going to be the names of your children because you're my prophet and I need to get a message to my people. Okay, God did not ask people small things. He didn't ask the prophets little tiny things. At the end of this, Gomer, Hosea's wife, she leaves him. You read throughout the story, she leaves him and goes and lives as a prostitute. And Hosea has to go track her down and buy her back and take her back home with him, which again is an object lesson because God, while Israel left him and worshiped other gods and lived as a metaphorical prostitute among other gods, he went and he tracked down his people and he bought them back at a price like TJ mentioned for us during the Lord's Supper discussion. It's a powerful illustration, but it's also a man who's having to live the illustration. This is a huge, huge thing God is asking of his prophets. Being a prophet of God was an absolute occupational hazard. There wasn't insurance good enough for the prophets of God. because what they had to do was, by most standards, absolutely insane. We would have had a hard time listening to anything the prophets said. We don't even have time to look at all of them. We're already coming up on our time. But you think about Jonah. I mean, he was just told, go preach, and he said no, and he got swallowed by a fish. Like, that was kind of a big deal, right? You think about Jeremiah. Jeremiah was told, as one of these object lessons, to wear a yoke on his neck, like a yoke that like you would put on an ox to plow the field. So you're going to wear a yoke on your neck and walk around the city. And in the middle of that, this false prophet comes up to Jeremiah and breaks the yoke. And he's like, God has freed us. And like what? Like Jeremiah is working on behalf of God, and this false prophet tries to give a false message with this false object lesson. It's bizarre. You think about Nathan, which we referenced earlier. Nathan comes before King David and is charged with the task of saying, hey, you've done horrible, horrible things. You're the guy that you want to kill. That was his job. Like, do you remember what happens if you come before the king unannounced? You remember the story of Esther? If she came into the presence of the king and he didn't point his scepter, she gone. So the prophet of God, Nathan, is told to come before the king. And not just invite him to dinner, right? Come before the king and make sure he knows when you leave that he is wicked. That's a dangerous spot. The prophets of God had to be all in. Not only did the prophets have to be all in, but their families sort of had to be all in as well. You think about Jeremiah laying on the ground. Who was taking care of him? Who was tending to him while he was laying on his side for a year? I imagine it had to be someone close to him, right? You're not going to hang out with the guy eating Ezekiel bread if you don't have to, right? Listen, how did the impact of what they had to name their children come up? I'm going to be a little bit silly here, but like 7th grade, No Mercy shows up to school and gets roll call. People knew these kids' names. They knew who they were, right? Isaiah had a son, and his name was a remnant shall return, right? But the problem with that is that they hadn't been taken into exile yet. So when he was born and named a remnant shall return, he was a prophecy to everyone that we're going to be taken into exile. Then a remnant shall return. That was his name. His name was a sentence. Like, this is ridiculous. This permeated the lives of the prophets. In fact, I think you could go as far as saying that the prophets' lives were not their own. If you were going to be a prophet of God, you were giving up your life. You were giving up your life and your rights to do things as you wanted to do them. You were giving up the choice in some cases as to who you married. You were giving up what you ate. You were giving up what you wanted to do. You had to be all in. The prophets of God were all in. They did everything God asked them to do, and it was incredible. It was difficult things. It was life-altering things. It was reputation-shattering things. It was challenging physically, emotionally things. And they did what God asked them to do because they were all in. So these men oozed faith in God. They did everything they were asked, and they trusted in God every step of the way. The life of the prophets belonged to God. They were all in. The question this morning, are you all in like the prophets? Let's take just 1 second and look at the easiest thing. The easiest, I don't know which one I would pick necessarily, but the easiest thing that we looked at today, the easiest thing might be Ezekiel building a model city and surrounding it with, to tell people it was going to be taken. If God told you to build a model of the town of Flower Mound and go into Parker Square and set it up and start shouting at people, we're about to be taken over, could you do that? I don't know if I could do that. That seems really difficult. Not only am I not an artist, but that's embarrassing, how about cutting your hair off? If God said, shave your head, cut your beard, 2 big problems for me. I don't do those things often. But shave your head, cut your beard, and then get these clumps of hair and chop them up and shout at people, this is our future. This is what is coming. Could we do that? How about Jonah? I think by all accounts, Jonah would have the easiest command by God. Just go preach to Nineveh. And he said, no, thank you, I hate them. I want to take that response from Jonah and contrast it with, I believe the guy's name was Penn Jillette, who is an atheist. And he said one time, how much, if someone truly believes in heaven and hell, and that if I don't believe in God, I'm going to hell for all eternity, how much would someone have to hate me not to tell me about it? So maybe we would never look at Jonah and say, I don't hate people and therefore am not preaching. But I think what Penn Jillette says about not doing it implies hatred. Certainly, I don't think we're all malicious, hateful people, but the simplest of the things the prophets were asked to do, would we do them? The question I want to put before us today is, are we all in? Because at every time, in every place, in every dispensation, in every household, in every nation, God has expected people that follow him to be all in. And if we're not there, we need to keep working to be all in for God. If you have the need of the church this morning, after this study, maybe you need to be all in and you realize there's some areas in your life that you need help with. That's what the church is for. If you have need of the congregation for prayers, we'll pray with you and pray for you. If you have the need to become a Christian and start that journey of being all in by being washed in the blood of Christ and having your sins forgiven, you can come forward this morning and let that be made known while we stand and sing.